Hello, tonight we begin our journey on a quiet stretch of coast where pale sand meets a calm, breathing sea. In the present moment, waves move gently against the shore, and a city has not yet fully arrived, but the idea of it already exists. This is Alexandria, not as stone and marble, but as a plan taking shape in human minds. It is evening in the ancient world, and the story begins softly, with intention, rather than noise. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you wish, share your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, soften your surroundings, and let's quietly step into tonight's story. They tell that in 331 BC, Alexander of Macedon stood on this coast and looked out across the Mediterranean. He was young, already famous, and moving fast, yet here he paused. The land was flat and open, bordered by sea and marsh, with the island of Pharos resting offshore like a quiet marker. Alexander imagined a city that would join worlds together, Greece and Egypt. Land and sea, thought and trade. Historians still argue whether Alexander personally designed the city's layout, but the intention is clear. This was meant to be a place of order. The plan followed a grid, clean and measured, with wide streets crossing at right angles. This alone was a statement. Order could be built. Knowledge could be organized. Even before any library existed, the city itself was shaped like a diagram. One mainstream historical fact is firm here. Alexandria was founded as a planned city, not an organic one. A quieter, almost quirky detail is that ancient sources say the city's outline was first traced in flour because chalk was not available. Birds reportedly came down to eat the lines, which some took as a good omen. Alexander did not stay long. He moved on, as he always did, and died only a few years later. But the dream remained behind. When his empire fractured, Egypt fell to one of his generals, Ptolemy, later known as Ptolemy I Sota. Unlike Alexander, Ptolemy stayed. He chose Alexandria as his capital and began the slower work of turning vision into routine life. Ptolemy ruled carefully. He wanted stability, legitimacy, and memory. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a pharaoh in the old Egyptian sense, while also keeping Greek traditions alive. Alexandria became the place where this balance was possible. It had a deep harbour, access to Nile grain, and constant movement of people. Merchants, sailors, priests, and scholars all passed through its streets. Yet Ptolemy imagined more than trade. He wanted Alexandria to be a center of the world's thinking, not loud or mystical, but practical and comprehensive. A place where knowledge could be gathered, sorted, and preserved. Historians still argue whether this impulse came from personal curiosity or political calculation. Most likely, it was both. Knowledge gave power, and power protected knowledge. The city began to fill with institutions. Temples, administrative buildings, markets, and palaces appeared. Among them was the royal quarter, the Mouseion, where the court lived and worked. This area would later house the Mouseion, the place that would become inseparable from the library itself. But at this stage, nothing was yet monumental. The ambition was quiet and methodical. Alexandria's population grew quickly. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, and others lived side by side, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. One odd detail often overlooked is that the city had separate legal systems for different ethnic groups, all operating at once. It was efficient, if not always fair. This complex coexistence shaped the city's intellectual life. Many languages were spoken here, and many texts circulated through private hands long before any state collection. The city's calm order did not mean stillness. Ships arrived daily. Ideas came with them. Ptolemy understood that if Alexandria was to be a center, it needed to absorb the world rather than conquer it. This belief, simple and almost modern, laid the groundwork for what would follow. As night settles over the early city, lamps glow along straight streets. The sea remains close, steady, and patient. No one yet speaks of a great library, but the conditions for it are already in place. A city designed to collect, to organize, and to remember. The dream has moved forward, and it is ready for its next quiet step. The city had found its rhythm, and within that rhythm, a new kind of space began to form. It was not a temple in the usual sense, and not a school in the strict way later ages would define one. It was called the Mouseion, the House of the Muses. The name suggested devotion, but the purpose was practical. This was a place where thinking could continue without interruption. The idea did not appear suddenly. It grew from conversations at court, from the needs of administration, and from a broader curiosity about how the world could be understood. Ptolemy supported the project, but the shaping mind behind it was likely Demetrius of Phalerum. He had once ruled Athens as a statesman, then lost power, and finally arrived in Alexandria as an exile. That change of fortune gave him patience and focus. One mainstream historical fact is that Demetrius was associated with the early organization of the Mouseion and its collections. A quieter, almost ironic detail is that a man once driven from a city for political reasons helped design a place meant to preserve ideas beyond politics. The Mouseion was attached to the royal quarter. This mattered. Scholars were supported directly by the state. They were given food, lodging, and exemption from taxes. In return, they were expected to read, teach, and write. There was no fixed curriculum. Study followed interest rather than schedule. Historians still argue whether this freedom led to deeper insight or encouraged intellectual isolation, but it clearly allowed long, uninterrupted work. The building itself was not a single hall of shelves. It was a complex. There were walkways, dining areas, lecture rooms, and shaded spaces for discussion. Scrolls were stored nearby, likely in multiple rooms, arranged by subject. The Mouseion was a living environment, not a warehouse. One odd detail mentioned in later sources is that scholars shared common meals, a small but important ritual that kept the community steady and human. Early collecting began almost immediately. Texts arrived as gifts, purchases, and copies. Works of Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedians were sought first, as models of language and thought. Scientific treatises followed. Medical texts from Egypt and Mesopotamia were included, sometimes translated, sometimes left in their original form. The aim was not perfection, but completeness. To gather what existed, even if it was flawed. This hunger for texts was systematic. Ships that entered Alexandria's harbour were sometimes asked to surrender any books on board. The originals were kept. Copies were returned. Historians still debate how often this happened and how formal the policy was, but the pattern reflects the mindset of the institution. Knowledge was something to be secured, even at some cost to goodwill. Cataloguing became necessary early on. Without order, the collection would collapse under its own weight. Lists were drawn up. Titles, authors, and subjects were noted. This was not yet a full library system, but it was the beginning of one. A quirky detail often missed is that mistakes in authorship were common, and some works were misattributed for centuries as a result. Accuracy, like the collection itself, was a gradual achievement. The Mouseion also functioned as a place of debate. Scholars read aloud, they corrected one another's texts, they argued over single words in famous lines. These debates were not dramatic. They were slow and precise. The goal was clarity, not victory. Over time, this culture of careful disagreement became one of Alexandria's defining traits. Not everyone approved. Some outsiders viewed the Mouseion as detached from daily life, a place of men supported by royal funds while others worked. This criticism is preserved in a few sharp comments from later writers. Yet even these critics acknowledged the scale of what was being attempted. No other city had tried to gather knowledge in this way, under one roof, with public support. As the years passed, the Mouseion settled into routine. Lamps were lit each morning, scrolls were unrolled and rolled again. Voices echoed softly along covered paths. The institution did not announce itself loudly. It simply continued, and in doing so, it laid the foundation for something larger, something that would soon be spoken of not as a house, but as a library. As the Mouseion matured, the library took on a clearer shape. It was no longer just a growing pile of scrolls near scholars at work. It became a system. Quiet, careful, and built for use rather than display. The goal was simple to state and difficult to maintain. Every text should be findable, readable, and preserved for the next reader. The scroll was the basic unit. Papyrus sheets were cut, glued, and rolled around a wooden rod. A small tag, often tied at the end, named the work and its author. These tags faced outward on shelves set into walls or placed in cabinets. The arrangement followed subjects: poetry in one area, law in another, medicine, math, and natural study in others. One mainstream historical fact is well established here. The library relied on subject grouping long before modern shelving, even if the details varied over time. Finding a text still required guidance. That role fell to catalogues. The most famous of these was created by Callimachus, a poet and scholar who preferred lists to legends. His work, known as the Pinarchs, organized authors by genre and added brief notes about each text. It was not a catalogue in the modern sense, but it worked. A reader could trace a topic and narrow a search. A quirky detail is that Callimachus disliked long books, and once joked that a big volume was a big problem. Historians still argue whether this reflected personal taste or a practical concern about storage. Copying was constant, papyrus aged, ink faded. A text that went unread could vanish within decades. Scribes worked steadily, copying popular works and repairing damaged ones. Accuracy mattered. Scholars compared copies line by line. Differences were noted in the margins. Over time, preferred versions emerged. This process shaped the texts that later ages inherited. It was slow and methodical, with few shortcuts. Translation also played a role. Greek remained the main language of the library, but texts arrived in others. Some were translated into Greek for wider use. Others were studied as they were. The most famous project was the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, later called the Septuagint. While details are debated, it reflects the library's wider aim, to make knowledge usable across boundaries. How large was the collection? Ancient numbers vary widely. Some later writers claimed hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Modern scholars are more cautious. Based on space, staff, and copying rates, estimates often range between 40,000 and perhaps 400,000 scrolls at its peak. Historians still argue whether these figures include duplicates and working copies. What matters more is scale. For the ancient world, this was enormous. The library was not a single room filled with shelves. It spread across buildings in the royal quarter. Storage areas changed as collections grew. Some texts moved, others were duplicated and placed elsewhere. This flexibility kept the system alive. It also complicates later accounts, which often imagined one dramatic space rather than a network. Rules guided use. Scrolls did not leave the complex easily. Scholars read on sight. Notes were taken on wax tablets or spare papyrus. This reduced loss and kept the collection intact. A lesser-known detail is that some scholars complained about this restriction, arguing it slowed their work. The policy remained, a sign that preservation outweighed convenience. Errors still occurred, titles were misread, authors confused. Some works entered the collection under false names and stayed that way for centuries. The staff corrected what they could. They accepted that perfection was not possible. The system was designed to improve over time, not to lock itself into one moment. At the center of it all was routine. Each day followed a pattern. Scrolls were returned, shelves were checked, copies were compared. No ceremony marked these acts. Their power lay in repetition. The library endured because it functioned quietly. As night settled over Alexandria, the rooms held steady. Scrolls rested in order, lamps dimmed. The system waited for morning. It did not promise immortality. It offered continuity, one careful step at a time. The library did not grow on quiet habit alone. Behind its steady routines stood royal will. The Ptolemies were not distant patrons. They were active participants in the hunt for knowledge. For them, books were not decoration. They were tools of rule, symbols of prestige, and proof that Alexandria stood at the center of the civilized world. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, carried this ambition forward with particular energy. He expanded what his father began. Ships arriving in the harbor were searched more carefully. Any books found were taken for copying, and sometimes for permanent keeping. The originals stayed. Copies were sent back. One mainstream historical fact is clear. Alexandria pursued texts aggressively in a way no earlier city had attempted. A quieter detail is that the copies returned were often labeled as such, marked politely but firmly as replacements. This practice caused resentment. Merchants complained. Visiting scholars grumbled, yet the policy remained. The court viewed it as necessary. Historians still argue whether this system was consistently enforced or applied only to selected ships. What matters is the mindset behind it. Knowledge was considered a resource that should flow inward, even if the process felt uneven. The Ptolemies also bought entire private libraries. Athens, Rhodes, and other cities supplied texts for high prices. In one famous case, the official copies of Greek tragedies, held in Athens, were borrowed. A large deposit was paid as security. The originals never returned. The deposit was kept instead. This story may be embellished, but it reflects a known pattern. Prestige texts were worth any cost. Royal curiosity extended beyond Greek culture. Egypt itself held deep traditions of writing, though often in forms unfamiliar to Greek readers. Priestly records, medical manuals, and astronomical notes existed in temple archives. Some of this material entered the library through translation or summary. Not all of it survived, but the effort mattered. It signaled respect for local knowledge rather than its dismissal. The most famous translation project was the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Later tradition tells of 70 or 72 scholars working independently, producing identical results. Modern historians treat this story with caution. What is widely accepted is simpler. A Greek translation was made in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy II, likely to serve the city's large Jewish population. A quirky detail is that this translation later became foundational for early Christianity, far beyond what its sponsors imagined. Why did the Ptolemies support this work? Partly administration. Greek-speaking officials needed access to local laws and traditions. Partly control. Translation made texts legible to power. Historians still argue whether cultural openness or political calculation mattered more. In practice, both moved together. The court's interest shaped scholarship itself. Scholars knew what topics pleased their patrons. Geography, chronology, medicine, and engineering received steady support. Work that helped navigation, taxation, or timekeeping found eager ears. Poetry and philosophy remained important, but utility gained ground. This balance gave Alexandrian scholarship its distinct tone. Not every Ptolemy ruled with equal care. Some were distracted by court intrigue or war, yet the institutional momentum carried forward. Funds continued. Appointments were made. The library became part of how the dynasty defined itself. To rule Egypt was to protect learning. There were limits. Censorship existed, though it was subtle. Work seen as disruptive could be ignored rather than destroyed. Silence was often the chosen method. A lesser-known detail is that satire targeting the court rarely circulated widely in Alexandria, suggesting quiet pressure rather than open bans. As years passed, the royal presence became background rather than spotlight. The library ran daily without constant oversight. Still, its origins in power never vanished. The shelves reflected choices shaped by kings. By evening, lamps glowed again in reading rooms. Scrolls taken from distant ports rested beside local records. The Ptolemies slept in their palaces, confident that knowledge was being gathered in their name. The library had become an extension of royal curiosity, steady and watchful, waiting for the next ship to arrive. Inside the library, history moved at a slower pace. The great events of the world rarely entered these rooms directly. What mattered here were small actions repeated daily. A scroll unrolled. A margin checked. A line read again to be sure it said what it seemed to say. The scholars of Alexandria lived within this rhythm, steady and focused. They did not all work the same way. Some arrived early, preferring quiet light. Others stayed late, when the rooms cooled and voices softened. Many lived nearby, supported by stipends that covered food and housing. This support allowed concentration. One mainstream historical fact is that scholars attached to the Mouseion were paid by the state, freeing them from other labour. A quieter detail is that some complained anyway, often about meals, which suggests that even in ancient times, free food invited strong opinions. Euclid worked here, or at least taught in this environment. His approach to geometry was calm and exact. He built arguments step by step, starting from simple points and moving forward without hurry. When a student once asked for an easier way to learn geometry, Euclid is said to have told a servant to give the student a coin, since he wanted profit from learning. The story may be shaped by later humour, but it reflects the tone of the place. Knowledge was valued for its own sake. Eratosthenes arrived later. He was a poet, a mathematician, and eventually the head librarian. His days moved between texts and observation. By comparing shadow lengths in different cities, he calculated the size of the Earth with surprising accuracy. This is a well-known fact. A lesser-known detail is that some contemporaries mocked him for trying to measure something so vast from so little data. Historians still argue whether his exact method was fully his own or built on earlier ideas. Archimedes did not live in Alexandria permanently, but he studied here. He read, corresponded, and argued with scholars who did. His work on mechanics and volume circulated through copies made by Alexandrian scribes. The famous story of him running through the streets shouting after a bath likely took place elsewhere, but his quieter hours belonged to rooms like these. Callimachus preferred words to numbers. He organized texts and wrote poetry in careful lines. He disliked excessive length and believed precision mattered more than scale. His work shaped how texts were described and remembered. A quirky detail is that he once criticized epic poets for being too long-winded, which is ironic given how much later ages loved long epics. Daily life included teaching. Younger students listened. Questions were asked softly. Corrections were made without ceremony. Disagreement was expected. It was also controlled. Argument stayed focused on the text. Personal attacks were frowned upon, at least in theory. The culture valued clarity over drama. Not all scholars were famous. Most were not. Many names are lost. They copied texts, checked references, and prepared summaries. Their work made later achievements possible. Historians still debate how much innovation occurred here versus careful preservation. In practice, the two were closely linked. There were small rituals. Scrolls were aired to prevent damage. Ink was mixed fresh. Notes were taken on wax and erased later. One odd habit mentioned in later sources is that some scholars preferred to walk while reciting passages aloud, pacing along covered paths. It helped memory and kept the mind alert. Humour existed, quietly. A misplaced scroll could cause mild panic. A copied line missing a word might prompt a dry comment about human fallibility. One light joke survives in a fragment, where a scholar blames a scribal error on a cat crossing the table. Whether the cat was real remains unclear. As evening came, the rooms grew calm. Scrolls were returned. Lamps were trimmed. Scholars departed or settled in for quiet reading. Their lives were not dramatic. They were measured, patient, and deeply focused. In that steady attention, the library found its true strength. Alexandria's reputation often rests on famous men, but women were present in its intellectual life as well. Their names appear less often in surviving records, yet their work formed part of the city's steady rhythm of study and teaching. They read, calculated, observed, and explained. Their presence was not dramatic. It was practical and continuous. In earlier generations, women appear mostly at the margins of the sources. Some were daughters of scholars who learned at home before entering wider circles. Others were skilled in medicine or mathematics and taught privately. One mainstream historical fact is that women in Hellenistic Egypt held more legal rights than in many Greek cities, including property ownership. A quieter detail is that this legal independence made it easier for some women to support scholarly lives, even if social barriers remained. By the late Roman period, one figure stands out clearly: Hypatia of Alexandria. She lived in the 4th and early 5th centuries, long after the library's early peak. Yet she worked within the same tradition of careful explanation and patient inquiry. Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a mathematician and commentator. She learned first at home, then moved naturally into public teaching. Hypatia taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Her lessons were spoken rather than written. Students gathered to listen, take notes, and ask questions. She explained complex ideas with calm clarity. Later writers emphasize her ability to make difficult subjects feel orderly. Historians still argue about the exact content of her courses, but there is agreement on her role as a respected teacher. She did not work alone. Other women studied alongside her and before her, though their names are often lost. Some assisted with astronomical calculations, others copied texts or helped prepare teaching materials. A quirky detail preserved in one letter suggests that Hypatia advised a former student on building a scientific instrument, possibly an astrolabe, indicating hands-on technical knowledge. Hypatia's influence extended beyond the classroom. She corresponded with civic leaders and scholars. Her advice was sought on both intellectual and practical matters. This visibility made her unusual but not isolated. Alexandria's mixed culture allowed certain exceptions, especially for those with established reputations. Religion shaped the era. Pagan, Christian, and Jewish communities lived side by side, sometimes uneasily. Hypatia herself followed a Neoplatonic philosophical tradition. She taught openly and did not seek conflict. Her classrooms focused on geometry, logic, and the structure of the cosmos, not belief. Historians still debate how neutral such spaces could truly be in a tense city, but her teaching endured for decades. Later events often overshadow her life. Many accounts focus heavily on her violent death. In this telling, the emphasis remains elsewhere. What matters here is how she lived and taught. She represented continuity, a link between earlier Alexandrian scholarship and later generations. Her calm presence showed that learning could persist even as institutions changed. Women's contributions did not end with her. Medical practice especially remained an area where women worked quietly. Midwives recorded observations. Healers passed down practical knowledge. These texts rarely carried names, but they circulated nonetheless. The library's broader culture valued useful information, regardless of its source. One lesser-known detail is that some ancient commentators express surprise not at Hypatia's learning but at the public respect she received. This reaction itself reveals expectations of the time. Respect was noteworthy because it was given. As evening came to Alexandria in Hypatia's time, lamps still lit lecture rooms. Students gathered, some young, some older, all listening. The library as an institution had changed, but the method remained. Careful explanation, shared inquiry, a soft, steady light passed from teacher to student. In this way, women shaped Alexandrian scholarship not by spectacle, but by persistence. Their work flowed quietly through generations, steady enough to endure long after buildings and shelves had faded. By the time Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, the city was old, busy, and politically tense. The library had already existed for nearly 3 centuries. Its routines were well established. Yet the calm order that sustained it could be disrupted by events far beyond its walls. Caesar came pursuing Pompey, drawn into a local power struggle between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra. Fighting broke out near the harbour. Ships were set on fire to block enemy movement. One mainstream historical fact is widely accepted. A fire started in the harbour area during Caesar's Alexandrian campaign. Ancient sources agree on this point, even if they differ on the details. The question that followed was larger. Did the library burn? Historians still argue whether the fire reached the main library buildings or only nearby storage areas. The most cautious accounts suggest that warehouses near the docks, where books awaiting processing were kept, were damaged or destroyed. These may have held thousands of scrolls, but not the entire collection. Ancient writers are not consistent. Some mention a loss of books without naming the library directly. Others, writing centuries later, speak of a great destruction. Modern historians tend to favor the earlier, quieter reports. They note that the main library was located inland, within the royal quarter, some distance from the docks. Fire could spread, but stone buildings and open courtyards slowed it. A quirky detail preserved in one later account claims that 40,000 scrolls were lost. The number appears precise, yet historians still debate whether it represents a guess, a symbolic figure, or a real estimate. What seems clear is that the library continued to function afterward. Scholars still worked, new texts were copied. This alone suggests that the core institution survived. Caesar himself wrote little about the incident. His commentaries focus on strategy and victory. The absence of detail about the library may reflect ignorance rather than indifference. To him, it may have been another unfortunate cost of war, not a defining moment. The city recovered quickly. Cleopatra secured power with Roman support. Alexandria returned to its routines. The library's staff adapted, as they had before. Damaged texts were replaced when possible. Loss was absorbed into the slow work of copying and collecting. This episode reveals something important. The library was not a fragile miracle that vanished at the first sign of danger. It was a system. Damage could occur without total collapse. Historians still argue how much was lost and how deeply the fire cut, but few now support the idea of complete destruction at this stage. A lesser-known detail is that Roman involvement may have indirectly benefited the library. Later, Roman emperors supported scholarly work, seeing it as part of imperial prestige. The connection between power and learning continued, though the balance shifted. Emotionally, later generations attached great weight to this fire. It became a symbol of loss. The image of flames consuming wisdom is powerful and easy to remember. Yet in reality, the event was likely limited and localized. The true decline of the library was slower and quieter. In the days after the fire, smoke cleared. The harbour reopened. Scrolls remained on shelves inland. Scholars returned to their work. Lamps were lit again in the evenings. The routines resumed, not unchanged, but intact. This moment, often told as an ending, was in fact a pause, a reminder that knowledge lives within structures and people, not just buildings. Fire passed through part of Alexandria. The library endured, carrying forward what it could, ready to face the longer changes yet to come. After Caesar, Alexandria entered a long Roman chapter. The city remained large and busy, but its role shifted. Power now flowed from Rome. Decisions were made farther away. The library continued to exist, yet it no longer stood at the center of royal ambition as it once had. Under the early emperors, support remained. Augustus and his successors valued Greek learning. Scholars still taught. Texts were still copied. One mainstream historical fact is that Alexandria remained a major intellectual center during the early Roman Empire, yet priorities slowly changed. Administration, taxation, and control mattered more than gathering every book in the world. The Mouseion adapted. Its membership shifted. Some scholars moved to Rome where patronage was growing. Others stayed, working with fewer resources. Appointments became less frequent. The steady flow of new texts slowed. Historians still argue whether this was due to reduced funding or changing scholarly fashions. Likely, both played a role. The library's physical spaces changed as well. Buildings aged. Repairs were made, but not always promptly. Some storage areas may have been repurposed. The collection became more fragmented. A quirky detail appears in a late source that mentions scholars searching multiple rooms for a single text, suggesting that the once clear system had grown uneven. Religious life in the city also evolved. New cults appeared. Christianity spread. Older traditions persisted. These shifts affected what people chose to study and preserve. Philosophy and rhetoric remained important. Certain forms of pagan literature became less central. This was not a sudden rejection, but a gradual narrowing of focus. Roman officials were pragmatic. They valued useful knowledge. Engineering, medicine, and law received attention. Purely speculative work found less support. Historians still debate whether this marked a decline or a transformation. In many ways, learning became more specialized rather than less serious. Political unrest also left its mark. Alexandria was prone to riots. Ethnic and religious tensions flared at times. These disturbances disrupted daily life, including scholarly work. Classes were cancelled. Access to buildings was restricted. Each episode left small gaps that accumulated over generations. The library did not announce its fading. There was no moment when a door closed for the last time. Instead, routines shortened. Fewer scholars lived on site. Fewer copies were made. Some texts simply wore out and were not replaced. One odd detail noted by later commentators is that certain rare works were known by title but no longer seen, a quiet sign of loss. Despite this, learning continued in new forms. Private teachers took on students. Smaller collections appeared in homes and temples. Knowledge dispersed rather than disappeared. The library's influence spread outward, even as its core weakened. By the 3rd century, the institution had become more symbolic than central. People still spoke of Alexandria as a place of learning, but fewer could point to a single, unified library. The idea remained strong, the structure less so. As evening settled over the Roman city, lamps still burned in some study rooms. Scrolls were read, notes were taken. The sound was softer now, more isolated, yet the habit of inquiry persisted. This period is often overlooked because it lacks drama. No great fire, no clear ending, just time, working steadily. The years thinned out the institution, not by force, but by gradual change. And in that thinning, the library's story moved quietly toward its final chapters. The story most often told about the Library of Alexandria is simple and dramatic. A single great fire, flames racing through shelves, knowledge lost in one night. It is an image that stays in the mind. It is also, almost certainly, wrong. No ancient source describes one final blaze that destroyed the entire library at once. Instead, the record shows scattered references, written across centuries, each pointing to different moments of damage or decline. Historians still argue whether any one of these events deserves to be called the end. Most now agree that the idea of a single inferno is a later invention, shaped by memory rather than evidence. The earliest fire linked to the library is the one during Caesar's War, already discussed. That incident likely affected storage near the harbour, not the main collection. Later writers expanded its scope. Numbers grew larger, details grew sharper. This pattern is common in historical memory. Loss becomes clearer as distance increases. Another episode often mentioned occurred during the reign of Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century. Fighting in Alexandria damaged parts of the city, including the royal quarter. Some scholars suggest that remaining library buildings may have suffered then. Others note that by this time, the original institution had already changed form. Historians still debate how much, if anything, survived to be destroyed. A third moment enters the story in the late 4th century, during conflicts over religious sites. The Serapeum, often called the Daughter Library, was damaged and later closed. Some ancient authors link this to the end of Alexandrian learning. Modern historians are more careful. They point out that the Serapeum was not the original library, and that scholarship continued elsewhere afterward. One mainstream historical fact stands firm. There is no contemporary account that describes a single event wiping out the entire Library of Alexandria. The silence itself is telling. Such a catastrophe would likely have been noted clearly by those who lived through it. A quirky detail adds perspective. Several late sources blame different figures for the destruction. Caesar, Christians, Muslims. Each version reflects the concerns of its author's time. The library becomes a symbol onto which blame is projected. In this way, the myth tells us more about later fears than ancient events. So, what really happened? The most likely answer is also the least dramatic. The library declined through a series of disruptions, fires, political unrest, changing priorities, neglect. Each event removed a layer. No single moment ended it. Instead, the institution thinned, adapted, and eventually dissolved into other forms. This slow process is harder to picture. It lacks a clear image. There are no flames to watch, yet it fits the evidence better. Scrolls decay if not copied. Buildings fall if not repaired. Staff leave if not replaced. Knowledge does not vanish, it disperses. There is also a practical point often missed. Ancient libraries were not static treasures. They required constant labor. Without funding and interest, even the best system fails. Historians still argue whether economic strain or cultural change played the larger role. Most agree both mattered. One light joke appears in a medieval commentary, where the author sighs that people prefer stories of fire because dust and paperwork sound boring. The humor is small, but the point stands. The myth of one great fire persists because it offers closure, a clean ending. History rarely provides that. Alexandria's library faded in stages, each quiet on its own. Only when viewed together do they form a pattern of loss. As night falls on this part of the story, there is no blaze on the horizon. There is only time, moving steadily. Shelves empty one by one, rooms fall silent. The library does not die in a moment. It passes on piece by piece into other hands and other places. As the original library's influence spread and shifted, another space took on a quieter but important role. This was the Serapeum, a temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis, rising on a hill above the city. Within its walls existed what later writers called the daughter library. It was not a replacement for the original, and not a perfect mirror. It was an extension, shaped by new needs and changing times. The Serapeum served several functions at once. It was a religious center, a civic gathering place, and a site of learning. Its library holdings likely began as overflow from the main collection. Texts moved for access and storage rather than ceremony. One mainstream historical fact is that the Serapeum housed books and study spaces well into the Roman period. This made it one of the last visible links to Alexandria's earlier scholarly tradition. The collections here were probably more selective. Philosophy, rhetoric, science, and religious texts appear to have dominated. Works useful for teaching and public discussion found a place on its shelves. The Serapeum was accessible to a wider public than the royal quarter had been. This openness mattered. Knowledge here was closer to daily life. Architecturally, the complex was impressive. Wide steps led upward. Columns framed open courtyards. Inside, quieter rooms held scrolls and hosted lectures. A quirky detail noted by a late traveller is that visitors sometimes complained about the climb, joking that wisdom required strong legs. The comment is small, but it reminds us that this was a lived space, not an abstract idea. By the late 4th century, Alexandria was changing rapidly. Christianity had become dominant under imperial law. Pagan temples lost state support. Some were converted, others were closed. Tensions rose, especially where old traditions remained visible. The Serapeum stood at the center of this shift, both physically and symbolically. In the year 391, conflict erupted around the temple complex. Ancient accounts describe clashes between groups and a decisive intervention by imperial authorities. The Serapeum was closed. Statues were removed or destroyed. The building itself was repurposed. One mainstream historical fact is clear. The Serapeum ceased to function as a pagan temple at this time. What happened to the books is less certain. Historians still argue whether the library holdings were destroyed, dispersed, or relocated. Some suggest that valuable texts were removed beforehand. Others believe many were lost during the unrest. The sources are incomplete and written from strong perspectives. It is important to pause here. Later retellings often turn this moment into a violent climax, with shelves smashed and scrolls burned in anger. The surviving evidence does not support such a clear scene. There is no detailed ancient description of mass book burning at the Serapeum. Silence again plays a role. The absence of vivid detail suggests gradual loss rather than spectacle. A lesser-known detail appears in a Christian source that mentions the temple being cleared of idols but says nothing about books. This omission may reflect priorities, but it also suggests that texts were not the main target. They may have been moved, ignored, or quietly absorbed into other collections. After the closure, scholarly life did not end in Alexandria. Teaching continued in private homes and smaller schools. Philosophical instruction survived, though with new boundaries. Knowledge adapted, as it often does. The Serapeum's end marked a transition, not a collapse. The daughter library's role was thus a final bridge. It carried Alexandrian scholarship into a later world, one shaped by different beliefs and institutions. Its fate reflects broader changes across the empire. Support shifted, focus narrowed. Old spaces lost their meaning. There is a gentle irony here. The Serapeum, once meant to extend knowledge to a broader public, became remembered mainly for its closure. A light joke preserved in a much later commentary notes that people remember doors slamming more than years of open rooms. The humour is soft but accurate. As evening settles on this chapter, the hill grows quiet, the steps remain, the rooms change purpose, the scrolls are no longer visible, yet the work done here does not vanish. It moves on, carried by people rather than walls. The daughter library ends calmly, not in flames, leaving behind a quieter legacy that blends into the long flow of history. When the buildings of Alexandria grew quieter, the knowledge shaped there did not stay behind. It moved, slowly, unevenly, and often without ceremony. Texts travelled in bundles. Ideas travelled in minds. The library's greatest legacy was not a room of shelves, but a habit of careful study that others learned and carried forward. Even before the library's later decline, Alexandrian texts had begun to circulate widely. Scholars copied works and took them elsewhere. Students returned home with notes. Merchants carried books along trade routes. One mainstream historical fact is clear. Greek scientific and philosophical works spread across the Mediterranean long before the end of the ancient world. Alexandria was a major source, but not the only one. In the Roman period, Rome itself became a centre of learning. Wealthy patrons supported libraries and teachers. Alexandrian texts entered these collections through purchase and copying. Latin authors read Greek originals. Some translated them, others summarized or adapted them. This process preserved ideas, even when the original copies were lost. Monasteries later played a role. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Christian scholars copied works they found useful for education and theology. Geometry, astronomy, medicine, and logic remained relevant. Texts that could support calendar calculations or philosophical argument were especially valued. A quieter detail is that many manuscripts survived because they were reused in teaching, not because they were admired as ancient treasures. Translation became a bridge. Greek works moved into Syriac, a scholarly language used across parts of the Near East. From Syriac, some later moved into Arabic. This layered process introduced changes. Terms shifted. Examples were adapted. Historians still argue how much meaning was altered along the way, yet without these steps, much would have vanished entirely. By the 8th and 9th centuries, a new centre of learning emerged in Baghdad. The Abbasid caliphs supported translation on a scale not seen since Alexandria. Scholars sought out Greek works wherever they could be found. They translated Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and many others. One mainstream historical fact is that the House of Wisdom in Baghdad coordinated this effort, turning translation into an organized project. A quirky detail often overlooked is that translators were sometimes paid by the weight of the finished manuscript in gold. This encouraged thorough work, though it may also have encouraged generous margins. The story is debated, but it reflects the value placed on knowledge. Islamic scholars did more than preserve texts. They studied them critically. They corrected errors. They expanded on ideas. Algebra, optics, and medicine all grew through this engagement. Alexandrian methods, especially careful commentary and comparison of sources, shaped this work. The habit of questioning a text while respecting it continued. Astronomy offers a clear example. Ptolemies' works, named after an Alexandrian scholar, were studied deeply. Observations were checked against reality. New tables were created. Instruments were refined. Historians still debate how much original innovation occurred versus refinement, but the continuity of method is unmistakable. Medicine followed a similar path. Galenic texts, preserved through Alexandria and later translations, formed the basis of medical study for centuries. Physicians argued with Galen, corrected him, and learned from him. A lesser-known detail is that some Islamic physicians openly criticized ancient authorities, showing confidence rather than reverence. From the Islamic world, knowledge moved again. In medieval Spain and southern Italy, Arabic texts were translated into Latin. European scholars encountered Greek ideas through these versions. Universities formed. Curricula developed. The Library of Alexandria was rarely mentioned, but its influence was present in structure and content. This long journey reshaped the original material. No text arrived unchanged, yet the core ideas endured. Logic still followed careful steps. Geometry still built from definitions. Astronomy still relied on observation and calculation. The Alexandrian spirit survived without its name. One light joke appears in a medieval margin note, where a scribe complains that Aristotle is easier to understand in Arabic than in bad Greek. The humor is small, but it hints at the layered nature of transmission. Historians still argue about losses along the way. Many works mentioned in ancient catalogues never reappear. Others survive only in fragments, yet the scale of what did endure is remarkable. Knowledge crossed languages, religions, and empires. As evening settles on this chapter, there is no single place to point to. The library is everywhere and nowhere. In Baghdad, in Cordoba, in monastery scriptoria, and later in European universities. The shelves are scattered. The voices continue. Alexandria's learning moves on, carried quietly forward, still shaping how the world understands itself. The story of the Library of Alexandria does not end with empty rooms or silent shelves. It continues in patterns that feel familiar even now. The institution itself faded, but the ideas behind it endured. Order, access, preservation. These principles traveled forward, shaping how later societies thought about knowledge. One lasting influence was the idea that learning could be organized deliberately. Before Alexandria, texts were often private or sacred, kept in temples or personal collections. The library treated knowledge as something that could be gathered, sorted, and studied systematically. One mainstream historical fact is that later libraries, from Rome to Baghdad to medieval Europe, adopted similar goals of classification and access, even if their methods differed. The concept of cataloguing stands out. Callimachus's lists were early attempts to make large collections usable. Modern library systems are far more complex, but the impulse is the same. Without structure, abundance becomes confusion. This lesson, learned quietly in Alexandria, remains central to information science today. The library also shaped how scholarship worked. It promoted collaboration over isolation. Scholars read one another's work. They compared versions. They argued carefully. This environment encouraged criticism that was focused on ideas rather than personalities. Historians still argue whether this culture was unique or simply better documented here, but its influence is clear. Scientific method benefited as well. Observation, measurement, and comparison were valued. Eratosthenes measured the earth. Astronomers tracked stars. Physicians recorded symptoms. These practices did not begin in Alexandria, but they were refined there. A quirky detail often overlooked is that some Alexandrian scholars kept lists of failed experiments, noting what did not work. This habit feels modern, yet it appeared early. The library's approach to texts also mattered. Scholars did not treat books as untouchable objects. They corrected them. They questioned authors. Margins filled with notes. This balance of respect and critique became a model. Knowledge was honored, but not frozen. Even the idea of translation carries Alexandrian influence. Making texts available across languages expanded audiences and invited new interpretations. The Septuagint set a precedent. Later translators followed similar paths, accepting that meaning could travel, even if it shifted. Historians still debate how much was lost in translation, but far more was gained by access. Modern libraries echo these choices. Public access, preservation efforts, quiet study spaces. The design may differ, but the purpose aligns. A library is not just storage. It is an active system that depends on care and attention. Digital archives extend this legacy further. Today, texts exist without physical shelves, yet the same questions remain: how to organize, what to preserve, who decides. The challenges faced by Alexandrian librarians feel surprisingly current. Abundance brings responsibility. There is also a lesson in the library's decline. Institutions do not vanish only through disaster. They fade when support wanes, when priorities shift, when maintenance stops. This truth applies beyond libraries. Historians still argue whether the library could have survived longer under different conditions. The debate itself shows how deeply the idea still matters. The myth of the Great Fire persists because it offers a warning. Knowledge can be lost. But the fuller story offers reassurance. Knowledge also adapts. It moves. It finds new forms. Alexandria did not fail completely. It transformed. Education systems reflect this inheritance. Universities gather scholars. They provide time and space for study. They value peer review. These structures echo the Mouseion more than any single building. A light joke sometimes made among historians is that modern academics still complain about funding and food, much like their Alexandrian predecessors. The humor connects centuries through shared experience. The library's influence on science is especially strong. Fields like astronomy and geography trace methods back to Alexandrian work. Even when later scholars disagreed with conclusions, they used similar tools. Measurement, calculation, and skepticism traveled forward. Cultural memory also plays a role. Alexandria became a symbol. It represents both aspiration and loss. People imagine it as a place where all knowledge once gathered. This image is not accurate, but it is meaningful. It reflects a desire for wholeness and understanding. Historians still argue whether this symbolism helps or hinders real study. Some say it distracts from complex realities. Others believe it inspires care for knowledge. Both views hold weight. Myths can mislead, but they can also motivate preservation. The modern revival of Alexandria's name in new libraries shows this pull. Buildings built in its honor aim to connect past and present. They remind visitors that learning is a shared human project, spanning cultures and eras. The most important legacy may be the quietest, the belief that careful work matters, that copying a text accurately is valuable, that teaching patiently has long reach. These acts rarely draw attention, yet they shape civilizations. As the story closes, imagine a modern reader opening a book, or a student searching a database, or a librarian restoring a damaged page. These moments echo ancient routines. Lamps have changed. Tools have changed. The rhythm remains. The Library of Alexandria never truly died because it was never just a place. It was a practice. A way of treating knowledge as something worth tending, even when time presses hard. As night settles, the long journey of learning continues, quietly, patiently, one reader at a time.